Thank you very much. Or I should say, merci bien. I do speak a little bit of French, but don't ask any difficult questions in French because I studied it at school and it's been a long time. So my job here is to try to give you I guess, an overview of the UK's energy transition in about 20 minutes. I put together this presentation. I initially had about 50 slides. I now have closer to 20, so we'll see how it goes. I've scripted myself so I don't speak too quickly, because I know that when I'm listening to French, if anyone speaks quickly, I lose it entirely. So if you do start to get lost, just raise your hands and I will slow down. So very briefly, a little bit about Green Alliance. We're a think tank based in the UK. Our strapline is Leadership for the Environment, which really, I think, gets to the heart of what we're about, trying to encourage politicians to lead public opinion, to lead business, to deliver good environmental outcomes. We were set up in the late 1970s, so we've been around for a little while. And unlike many think tanks, we are explicitly pluralist. So a standard think tank will start with a political ideology and view the world through that lens and come up with interesting ideas. We view the world through an environmental lens. We want to see good environmental policy outcomes. And we try to think about how different political traditions, from left to right, could see those ideas, and indeed how policies that we come up with might play to those political views. But enough about us. I guess very briefly, my presentation sort of has two parts. There's a bit of a history lesson, and then there's a little bit of policy, along with some politics thrown in between. So I'll sort of signal between the two. So if I could choose one image to summarize the UK's energy past, this is it. This is the North Sea. We've got a lovely oil rig, or for anyone in the oil industry, please don't tell me that's actually a gas rig. One of the two, anyway. The last 40 years, I think, of UK energy has been really dominated by the North Sea, oil and gas. It's where the UK has got a huge amount of its energy. But the picture is starting to change. So this shows consumption, or rather production, over a period of time since the 70s. So you can see the UK did very well out of the North Sea. We had a huge boom, very good for the UK Treasury. But the North Sea, at least the British part of it, is starting to decline, and that decline looks terminal. Let me be clear, the UK will continue to pull oil and gas out of the North Sea for some time to come, 20, 30, perhaps 40 years. But its dominance in UK energy policy is coming to an end. I don't want to overplay the production side of things, but there is a physical basis for the UK's energy transition, and that's that the great boom of natural resources that we had is now largely past. Perhaps the more important driver, though, of change, I think, is politics, legislation, and public concern. So this graph, and there will be a lot of graphs in this presentation, shows public opinion, and it identifies when the public say that their top concern, or their key concern, is something to do with the environment or pollution. This is based on data from Ipsos Mori, which is a respected pollster. So if you sort of look here, there was a big peak here, and around this time, there was a huge amount of public concern about the environment in the UK. And this coincides very nicely with a piece of legislation called the Climate Change Act. This is a really fundamental piece of legislation. Arguably, it's well, we certainly think it was world leading. And what it has done is put in place a regime of long-term targets and short-term carbon budgets, which keeps the UK's energy transition on track. It's our way of trying to address the long-term future through mechanisms that cover 5-year periods repeated over time and cover the entirety of the economy. It was set up initially to deliver a 60% reduction of CO2 by 2050, later reduced to 80% in line with the climate change science that we all know and love. But of course, legislation is only one thing. In the UK, Parliament is sovereign, so if it decides to do things differently, it can always choose to do things differently. And political leadership remains important today. I mention this piece of work, which is something that we organized with the 3 leaders of the UK's biggest political parties. That's David Cameron, now re-elected Prime Minister, which happened about 3 or 4 months ago. There's probably a date on here somewhere. And essentially, it was our attempt to try to keep climate change depoliticized, to keep the sort of British debate about climate from turning into something that looks a bit more like the American debate, where you have a left that is broadly in favor of tackling climate change and a right that is very reticent about tackling climate change. And we thought there's a strong history of cross-party consensus in the UK, and energy transition requires that sort of policy agreement, particularly when you can get shifts in government. So we convinced, along with a bunch of other NGOs, it wasn't just us, but we played our part, to get Nick Clegg, Ed Miliband, and David Cameron to sign this pledge. And the pledge really has three components. The first is to secure a legally binding international deal to tackle climate change. The second is to stick to the UK's Climate Act and its intermediate carbon budgets. And the third is to phase out unabated coal from UK power generation. And we think that's probably the first and most graspable thing that the UK can do on climate policy. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on the Climate Change Act and the carbon budgets. This is a rather dense graphic, but I'll explain it a little bit because I think it tells an interesting story. So this is UK emissions back in 1990, and this is UK emissions in 2008. This is real data. These are projections. The carbon budgets basically tell a story about how the UK is going to decarbonize its economy. And what you can see happening between 1990 and 2008, if I look back at my notes and remind myself, is essentially you've got a story about changes in industry, power, and a little bit of other. So you've got power here, industry I think is in black or in sort of gray there, between 1990 and 2008. If you look between 2008 and 2030, there's another absolutely enormous difference, and that difference occurs primarily in this section here. This is the power sector. So the task for the UK is to totally decarbonize, or almost totally decarbonize, the power sector between, well, we started in about 2010 to 2030, so 20 years. We're 5 years in. Things are still broadly on track. And I think that this framework, the combination of 5-yearly carbon budgets and long-term target, has meant that politicians can't duck from the challenge, because let's be clear, this is an absolutely enormous challenge for the UK. You saw the primary energy demand, or rather the primary energy use statistics at the beginning. So I'm going to talk primarily about electricity in this, in the rest of this talk, because it's the big picture. It's the most rapid form of the energy transition now. So in addition to these carbon budgets, the UK also has the European renewables targets, or its share of the European renewables targets. And this is a DEC graphic, it's from the UK government, which breaks down a rough approximation of how we're going to meet this target. So you can see on this side there's electricity, on this side there's heat, and up there is transport. You can kind of ignore these for the rest of the conversation. Broadly speaking, transport is roughly on track. Heat, we're not doing so well on. Electricity, we're doing reasonably well on, and that's the majority of the transition. So, thinking about electricity, going back to the past, this is what has happened to the UK power sector over the last 40 or so years. We were dominated by coal back in the day. And around the 1990s, we started piling gas onto the system. This was because we were digging it out of the ground in the North Sea and building lots of CCGTs. This is the so-called dash for gas. As you can see, absolutely dramatic in its effect on the UK's electricity system. The yellow up there is nuclear, which, unlike France, we have a sort of, how should I put it, lukewarm relationship with in the UK. And this is the future, or at least this is the future as seen through the cost-optimizing models that Brits are so fond of. You feed in all of your technology costs into a big spreadsheet, and it spits out the energy transition that you might wish to see. This is a very complicated graph, so I will give you a simplified version in a second, but the key thing to note is this black line, which looks at emissions per kilowatt hour and goes from way up there, around 400, down to below 50. So I guess, given that I'm in France, you could say that the British need to learn from the French and get electricity sector emissions of roughly those that the French have today. So, vive la France. This is the simplified version, and I think tells the big story. You can see this big chunk of green at the top is wind, and you see an absolutely enormous increase in the amount of wind. And here you can see fossil generation. So this is coal. Very dramatic reduction in coal over the next couple of years. Continued role for gas for quite a long time. Again, this is just power sector, not heating. But we see gas being replaced by carbon capture and storage, which is both coal and gas, over a period of time. But the big picture, I guess, again, to try to summarize in just one image, is this: offshore wind. That's where the UK has its biggest resource. That's where it's expected to make its most renewable energy. Onshore wind is also very important. We have some political challenges with that at the moment in the UK. But if you were to just summarize in one image, that's probably it. So, on to part two, a little bit about how we plan to do this. And here all the pretty pictures disappear, I'm afraid, because it's all boring policy stuff, but I presume that's what you're here to see. So I'll talk a little bit about the strategy the UK has started on. I guess the UK really has taken for a long time, or has tried to take, an overtly technology-neutral strategy. So if I can caricature, I guess the Germans have decided that solar and wind are the electricity technologies that they prefer, and they're going to make those work. The French, as I understand it, although you can tell me differently, are having a debate about whether their future remains predominantly nuclear or whether it's a more renewable future. Either way, it's low carbon. And I guess the UK, to caricature, has said in typical Anglo-Saxon style that the market will decide. The trouble is that, with the exception of nuclear, no low-carbon technology actually is ready to compete in the market. So we have a little problem, and in order to solve that problem, we've decided we're going to reform the market to do two things at the same time. And I mention this specifically because I think it's led to a lot of challenges. The first is to develop renewables and other low-carbon technologies, and the second is to deploy them at the same time. So the idea is we've got these three technology families: renewables, nuclear, and CCS. We want to run them in parallel for a period of time through a market mechanism, which I'll explain in a second. And then we want to auction them off in a sort of brutal bloodbath of spreadsheets and markets sometime in the late 2020s. And the technology that is cheapest or most reliable or most preferred for whatever reason will win. And then we will find our cheap, low-carbon future. But the fact that we are deploying and developing at the same time, I think, has caused a lot of challenges, which I'll come on to in a bit. So how are we going to do this? The UK has put in place something which is called electricity market reform. It has four key policies, or four key drivers within it. So I'll take each of them in turn. The first is the capacity mechanism, or capacity market, if you prefer. And the idea behind that is to keep the lights on while we continue to get an ever greater proportion of variable renewables on the system. So the idea is if the UK has 20 or 30 gigawatts of offshore wind, sometimes the wind will blow, sometimes it won't. We need to secure our capacity in some kind of way, and so we have a market to try to do that. This is the key political aim in the UK, to keep the lights on. I mean, it's pretty clear. Every politician we talk to says if the lights go out, I'm out of office. Therefore, that's the sort of end-all, be-all. Unfortunately, the mechanism that we've chosen in the UK, I think, embodies a rather primitive view about what we need. It says we need capacity, power plants available there, ready to generate, switch them on at will, rather than what Green Alliance thinks, which is that we need flexibility. So if we're having variability in our supply in the form of renewables, or indeed invariability in the form of nuclear, and if we have variability in demand from people, because of course the demand curve is all over the place, then what we need is a flexible energy system that allows us to respond to those twin changes. So far, there's been one capacity market auction so far, and I guess if I'm a bit blunt, the UK has spent about £180 million on subsidising old nuclear and coal-fired power stations. I don't think that we can call it a great success so far, and that's because the power stations won't generate any more power than they would have done, and it's not clear that they'll stay on the system any longer than they would have done anyway. Perhaps the new auctions will prove to be more interesting, but the main aim, which was to build more gas-fired power stations, that hasn't happened yet. The second mechanism is the carbon floor price, and just tuning into some aspects of the conversation before, I'm guessing I might get some questions on this. So very briefly, this tops up the ETS price just for the UK, so we've got our special own price for things. It was meant to rise from about £18 per tonne up to £70 per tonne, so close to €100 per tonne in 2030. The revenue from the top-up all goes to the Treasury, which is very nice if you work in the Treasury, but not very nice if you don't. And because the people who don't work in the Treasury vote for the people who are in the Treasury, the price has been frozen for the last couple of years. That's a rather jokey way of putting it, but I guess the reality is that energy-intensive industry has said, hold on a second, why are we paying all this money? Why is it going to the Treasury? George Osborne, I don't like that. And George Osborne has decided that it's politically expedient to freeze the price. And I think that this speaks volumes about the problems of a carbon pricing mechanism that is set by politicians on an annual basis. Every year, the Chancellor stands up and says, this is what the price will be. It hasn't proved very effective in the UK. It's also not a great policy, let's be honest, because it doesn't do anything to affect investment decisions, because everyone in the markets discounts it, because they know it can change. And all so far that it's done has given essentially economic rents to existing low-carbon generators. So old nuclear has done very well, hooray for EDF. And wind turbines, for example, or solar panels that are already built, they get a bit of extra money for doing nothing. Not a very sensible way of doing things. The third mechanism is the emissions performance standard, and I think on balance that's a useful mechanism. It prevents unabated coal from operating in the UK, or rather new unabated coal from being built in the UK. That was its purpose. I think it has served a useful function, but that's probably all it's going to do. And the final mechanism, which is the rather wonderfully named feed-in tariffs with contracts for difference, which I spent a lot of time talking about. These really do the heavy lifting, so I will spend a little bit of time dealing with these in a bit more detail. There are sort of four components to it. The feed-in tariff has an agreed strike price, so when you produce energy, you get a fixed amount of money. If the electricity price goes above that, you pay back. So as an investor, you know you always get the same amount of money. It's extremely safe because once you get that contract, you're in a contractual agreement with the UK government, and so insofar as you believe the UK's contract law will be respected and that the British courts will back you, and that's been a pretty good bet for about 1,000 years, then you're pretty safe. The money is not paid for by government, which is an interesting little bit of accountancy. It's actually paid for by a levy on electricity bills. And this is interesting because that's nice because it doesn't necessarily add to the UK's public sector borrowing figures. Or rather, it was nice until our independent Office of National Statistics decided that actually it should count. That's become a major problem because the cost of support for this fixed tariff rises or falls as the wholesale price rises and falls. So if the wholesale price is very high, the top up to meet that strike price is very low, and therefore it seems cheap. If the wholesale electricity price is very low, then that top up rises enormously. And then politicians get very worried because you can see the bit that's the top up and the bit that is the electricity price is considered to be set by the market, and therefore not a politician's problem. It's funny how the interactions between market and government work in the UK. The big thing that has happened recently, though, and this is just in the last 3 years, is the whole cost of this system has been subsumed in a mechanism called the Levy Control Framework, which is the last bit there. And that sets a total cap on the amount of money that can be spent on low-carbon generation for a period of time. The current Levy Control Framework runs until 2020. This is a challenge because, of course, if the electricity price falls for whatever reason, whether that's zero marginal cost generation on the system or whether it's lower gas prices or whatever, then the total amount of renewable energy and nuclear and CCS, although those two aren't going so well, that you can buy falls. Conversely, if the electricity price rises, it increases. And I think that the main idea of the contracts for difference, which was to reduce finance costs by giving a very safe contract to investors. Once that's signed, you're home free as long as you can build the thing. Unfortunately, the uncertainty has come back in before you get the contract. So, for example, I'll mention offshore wind because it's the most exposed sector. There are 13 or 14 gigawatts of offshore wind proposals in the North Sea which have been permitted and which have plans in place to be built. And there's enough money for around 1 gigawatt per year. So if you're that 13th gigawatt, you're going to be waiting quite a long time before you get your money. And some of you may know that that doesn't go down very well in the corporate world. So there's a gentle dance going on between regulator, government, and industry about how those projects can be kept alive for a period of time. Now, I've done terribly because I'm slightly over my limit here, but I'm going to finish very briefly with some challenges. The first is that in the UK, fossil fuel prices rose and therefore electricity prices rose. And although that was 95% down to the international price of gas, this is what the media does with that. green targets cost £500 on every household bill. This is essentially a lie, and it's been debunked on a number of occasions, but it gets repeated, and it's a useful narrative because these are large, tall structures that everyone sees, and international gas markets are a bit ethereal and not very well understood by normal people. I think also one of the interesting things that's changed in the UK is that we have a tradition of climate skepticism in the UK, which is becoming decreasingly believed by normal people because the climate science is just so strong. So those people who previously were questioning climate science have switched and are starting to question energy policy. So the debate is no longer, is the planet warming or not? Do we need to tackle climate change or not? It's now, can we afford to tackle climate change? Are these terrible wind turbines the problem? Should we do something with them? And lo and behold, due to public concern, the current government is proposing to ban, well, that's not quite right, but they're proposing to restrict subsidies for new onshore wind turbines in the UK, possibly from 2016, possibly from 2020, we don't yet know. Which is interesting because onshore wind is currently the cheapest source of low carbon energy in the UK. So we're banning the thing that gives us the cheap bit of what we want because it's too expensive. The second major challenge is that the electricity market reform process totally ignored demand. This quote is from the Energy and Climate Change Committee, which said, basically, we've talked purely about the supply side, and the challenge with just talking about the supply side is that it costs money. The demand side is very, very cheap, and more importantly, the thing that has kept the UK energy transition on track throughout the recession, and it's been remarkably consistent, is what's happening over on my left to your right, a huge and I think largely unanticipated drop in demand for energy. In this case, this is gas demand. A couple of things we think is behind that, but let me just be clear, no one really anticipated it. Basically, it's home energy efficiency, EU eco-design rules on things like incandescent light bulbs and more efficient washers and that sort of thing, and UK boiler energy efficiency regulations that requires all boilers to be condensing, so 10 to 15% more efficient than they would have otherwise been. And I think the big picture here is that we've got some lovely but very expensive technologies, and these are a little bit out now because this slide is a couple of years old, which we can choose to pay for, or we can get the exact same energy services by procuring more efficient appliances, for example, or by reducing our energy demand. There's lots of evidence that the most efficient markets in the UK, or rather, sorry, the most efficient markets in the world at electricity, those in the United States, bizarrely enough, which is not a country with liberalized electricity markets for the most part, operate efficiently by pitting demand against supply. This is very reliable and it's very cheap. These are the sorts of costs that you would pay per megawatt hour. And just to give you an anecdote about how reliable this is, you may remember, this might have been an Anglo-world phenomenon, but there was a thing called the polar vortex in the United States in May 2013. Does anyone remember this? Raise your hand. Polar vortex? One man. Very good. Two. Okay. Let me explain. Possibly three. The polar vortex was this sort of bit of very cold Arctic air that descended across Canada and down into the east coast of the United States. It brought very, very low temperatures, such cold temperatures, in fact, that the stacks of coal outside of coal-fired power stations in the United States froze solid, which meant that the coal-fired power stations could not operate at a time of peak demand. This is obviously terrifying if you're trying to keep the lights on. But what did work was demand response. So the PJM market and ISO Northeast, two markets in the east coast of the United States, called on demand-side resources at that time, stuff like this, and the lights stayed on as a result of all of that. It's a lesson that the UK has yet to learn. The third challenge is that technology neutrality, the basic strategy of the UK, let's run nuclear, CCS, renewables at the same time, is becoming harder to justify. Nuclear in the UK is in a bad place, I think I'd say. There's a serious belief, not just by environmentalists, that Hinkley Point C won't be built. And everyone thinks that £92.50 per megawatt hour is quite a lot of money to pay, particularly when you get an index-linked return for 35 years. I've heard no one defending it on the grounds of price, because it's more expensive than both onshore wind and solar. Carbon capture and storage, which Green Alliance has been very much in favor of. We think it's a very useful technology. We'd like to see it happen. There's been a lost decade between 2006 and 2016 where we may get 2 demonstration projects. And the trouble with the lost decade is that, as you will know, it takes time to deploy technology. You can't just magic it up once it arrives. And so the question is, how much can we realistically deploy by 2030 when we want to have decarbonized the power system? So 2 final points, 2 reasons for optimism. The first is that some bits of low-carbon technology are becoming cheap very, very quickly. This is an American slide, but I think it holds true for the UK. What you see here is the price of fossil energy, and what you see over there on that extraordinary decline curve is the price of solar. No one expected this 5 years ago. I didn't expect this 5 years ago. Even the analysts from, is this Alliance Bernstein, call it the Terror Dome. Which is some obscure American reference even I don't understand. But I think the idea is that this is terrifying if you're a utility and you own existing assets that run on this stuff, because that decline curve, if it looks like it continues, gets you very low carbon energy at a very low price. And this is a narrative that's holding in the UK in a big way. There's lots of optimism. The second is that the British public has remained remarkably faithful to the idea of decarbonisation. So even though you have a rise in reported concern, 70% of people want more renewables. That's been consistent across the board for 4 years. Nearly 80% of people want the UK to phase out fossil fuel use, which is significant given how much we use. And 75% see climate change as very or fairly serious. In fact, the latest and most elaborate bit of research done on this, done by a bunch of academics under UKirk, says basically the British public wants and expects change, and I think they'll get it. Thank you.